The dust in Ash Bluff had a way of settling into everything. The creases of a man's hands, the folds of a woman's dress, the corners of caskets before they were lowered into the hard-packed earth. Clara Devane had grown accustomed to the taste of it on her lips, the way it clung to her black mourning dress like a second skin. She moved through the town's makeshift cemetery with the practiced grace of someone who had made peace with death, her hands steady as she arranged the wildflowers she'd gathered at dawn around the small pine coffin. The boy inside was barely 8 years old, crushed beneath the wheels of a supply train that had jumped its tracks 3 days prior. His mother had wept herself into silence, and his father had already ridden out to find work in the next county over, unable to bear the sight of his son's final resting place. Clara understood. Grief was a thing that moved differently through each person, sometimes like floodwater, sometimes like poison in the blood. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers brushing the rough wood of the coffin lid. The townspeople called her a bone witch, though never to her face. They said she could speak to the dead, that the spirits whispered their secrets to her in the moments before burial. Clara had never corrected them. Let them think what they would. In a place like Ash Bluff, where hope was as scarce as clean water, people needed to believe in something, even if it was the strange comfort of knowing their loved ones might still have a voice. The truth was simpler and more complicated than the stories they told. Clara had learned to listen, not to the dead, but to the living who remained, to the weight of their silence, to the way guilt and love could twist together like mesquite roots in drought-hardened soil. She had learned to read the signs that trauma left behind, the way it carved itself into the landscape of a person's face, their posture, their carefully chosen words. As she began to speak the words she'd spoken over so many graves, a movement caught her eye. A man sat his horse at the edge of the cemetery, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was lean and weathered, with dark hair that had gone prematurely gray at the temples, and he carried himself with the careful stillness of someone who had learned to be invisible when necessary. His clothes marked him as a stranger, too clean for a drifter, too practical for a gentleman. A railroad man, perhaps, or a surveyor, the kind who came to Ash Bluff with maps and promises, counting the cost of everything they saw. Clara finished her words and stood, brushing the dust from her skirts. The stranger had dismounted and was walking toward her, favoring his left leg slightly. She waited, her hand resting on the small silver cross at her throat, not out of faith, but out of habit. It had been her husband's, before the fire took him 3 years ago. "Ma'am," the stranger said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was rough, unused to polite conversation. "I'm sorry for your loss." "He wasn't mine," Clara replied, though not unkindly. "I just helped them find their way home." The stranger's eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they seemed to see too much. "Elias Rowe," he said, extending a hand that was scarred along the knuckles. "I'm here on business for the railroad." Clara didn't take his hand. "Clara Devane." "And what business would that be, Mr. Rowe?" "Land surveys, mostly. Making sure the right-of-way is clear for the new line they're planning." He lowered his hand, seemingly unbothered by her rejection. "I heard you work for the undertaker." "I help Mr. Whitmore when he needs it." Clara began walking toward the small chapel at the edge of the cemetery, and Elias fell into step beside her. "Death doesn't keep regular hours in a place like this." "No, I suppose it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment, and Clara could feel him studying her profile. "That was a beautiful service. The words you spoke, they weren't from any Bible I know." "The dead don't need scripture, Mr. Rowe. They need to be remembered. They need to know they mattered." Clara paused at the chapel door, her hand on the weathered wood. "Why are you really here?" Elias shifted his weight, and Clara noticed the way he unconsciously favored his left side. An old wound, she thought, the kind that never quite healed right. "I'm staying at the hotel for a few days while I do my surveys. I saw the funeral procession this morning and—" He trailed off, as if he couldn't quite explain what had drawn him to the cemetery. And you thought you'd pay your respects to a boy you never met? Something like that. Elias's smile was sad and crooked. I've seen enough death to know it deserves witnessing, even by strangers. There was truth in his words, Clara realized. Whatever else Elias Rowe might be, he understood the weight of loss. She studied his face, noting the fine lines around his eyes, the way his mouth was set in a permanent line of quiet suffering. A soldier, she thought, or had been once. The boy's name was Tommy Fairweather, she said finally. He wanted to be a locomotive engineer when he grew up. His mother told me he used to stand by the tracks every morning, waving at the train crews as they passed. God help him, Elias said quietly, and Clara heard something break in his voice. They stood in silence for a moment, both looking out over the cemetery, where the afternoon sun was beginning to slant long shadows across the headstones. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. I should get back, Clara said. Mr. Whitmore will be wondering where I've gone. Of course. Elias stepped aside to let her pass. Thank you for letting me intrude on your work, Mrs. Devane. Clara paused. It's Miss Devane now. My husband died in a fire 3 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I? Clara began walking toward town, then stopped and looked back. Mr. Rowe, be careful where you do your surveying. Some land in these parts has a way of fighting back. She left him standing there among the graves, and didn't look back again, but she could feel his eyes on her until she reached the main street, and something in her chest fluttered like a trapped bird. The next morning, Clara found Elias at her employer's door, hat in hand and a determined set to his shoulders. Mr. Whitmore was out on a house call. Old Mrs. Jenkins had finally succumbed to the consumption that had been eating at her lungs for months, so Clara answered the door herself. Miss Devane, Elias said, I was hoping we might speak. About what? Clara didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. About land. About the railroad's plans for this area. Elias glanced around as if checking to see who might be listening. I understand your employer owns a fair bit of property on the outskirts of town. Mr. Whitmore owns the funeral parlor and the plot where his house sits. Nothing more. According to my maps, he owns considerably more than that. Elias pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. Nearly 300 acres, including the old Devane homestead. Clara's blood went cold. The homestead burned. There's nothing left but ash and weeds. Land is land, Miss Devane, and the railroad needs a clear path through this valley. Elias's voice was carefully neutral, but Clara could see the tension in his jaw. I've been sent to negotiate a fair price for the property, or to assess what it might take to clear it by other means. Other means. Clara's voice was flat. You mean you'll take it whether we agree to sell or not? I mean, I'm hoping we can reach an agreement that satisfies everyone involved. Clara looked at the map in his hands, then back at his face. Mr. Whitmore took me in after the fire. Gave me work, a place to live, a purpose. That land is all I have left of my husband, Mr. Rowe. You can't negotiate with ashes. I understand this is difficult. Do you? Clara stepped closer, and Elias could see the fury building behind her carefully composed facade. Do you understand what it's like to watch everything you love burn to the ground? To be left with nothing but smoke and the smell of charred dreams? Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. Yes, Miss Devane. I believe I do. Something in his tone made Clara pause. She studied his face, noting the way his eyes seemed to look through her to some distant, painful memory. The war? Among other things? Elias folded the map and tucked it back into his jacket. I'm not here to cause you pain, Miss Devane. I'm just a man doing a job. And what happens if I refuse to sell? If Mr. Whitmore refuses? Elias met her gaze steadily. Then I'll have to report that to my employers, and they'll decide how to proceed. Which means you'll be back with different men who won't bother with negotiation. Possibly. Clara nodded slowly. At least you're honest about it. I try to be. Elias shifted his weight, wincing slightly. Miss Devane, might I ask you something? You can ask. Yesterday at the cemetery, you warned me about the land fighting back. What did you mean? Clara was quiet for so long that Elias began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Strange things happen in this valley, Mr. Rowe. Accidents, fires, people disappear or turn up dead in ways that don't make sense. The Lakota say the land is angry, that it's been fed too much blood. Maybe they're right. You don't strike me as a superstitious woman. I'm not, but I know when something feels wrong, and this whole valley feels wrong. Clara looked out toward the horizon, where heat waves were already beginning to shimmer above the desert floor. My husband used to say the same thing. He said the land was sick, that it needed time to heal. He was planning to leave Ash Bluff, to take me somewhere green and clean, somewhere we could start over. But the fire stopped him. The fire stopped everything. Clara's hand went to the cross at her throat. Sometimes I think it was a mercy. Sometimes I think it was murder. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. Murder? Strange how fires start, isn't it? How they spread so fast, burn so hot, leave so little behind. Clara turned back to him, and her eyes were sharp as broken glass. Strange how they always seem to happen right before someone needs the land for something else. Before Elias could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Mr. Whitmore was returning, his black wagon loaded with the supplies he'd need for Mrs. Jenkins's burial. He was a small, precise man with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly from years of handling the dead. Miss Clara, he called as he climbed down from the wagon. I see we have a visitor. Mr. Whitmore, this is Mr. Elias Rowe. He's here about the land. Mr. Whitmore's expression grew wary. Railroad? Yes, sir. Elias stepped forward, offering his hand. I'm here to discuss the possibility of purchasing your property for the new line. Mr. Whitmore shook his hand briefly, then looked at Clara. What did you tell him? That the land isn't for sale? And what did he tell you? That it might not matter whether we want to sell or not. Clara's voice was steady, but Elias could see the fear in her eyes. That he'll have to report our refusal to his employers. Mr. Whitmore nodded slowly. I see. And what do you think they'll do when they receive that report, Mr. Rowe? Elias felt the weight of both their stares. I don't know, sir. That's not my decision to make. But you have an opinion. I think, Elias said carefully, that the railroad generally gets what it wants, one way or another. Honest, at least. Mr. Whitmore began unloading his wagon. Miss Clara, would you help me with Mrs. Jenkins? Mr. Rowe, you're welcome to stay for coffee if you'd like. We can discuss this further. Thank you, but I should get back to my surveying. Elias touched his hat brim. Miss Devane, Mr. Whitmore. I'll be in touch. As he walked away, Clara watched him go with a mixture of anger and something else she couldn't quite name. He walked like a man carrying too much weight, and she found herself wondering what burdens he bore beyond the obvious one of his injured leg. He's not what I expected, Mr. Whitmore said quietly. No, Clara agreed. He's not. That evening, Clara walked out to the ruins of her old homestead as the sun was setting. It was a habit she'd developed in the months after the fire, this pilgrimage to the place where her happiness had died. The skeletal remains of the house were still visible, blackened beams jutting from the earth like the ribs of some great beast. The windmill that had once pumped water for their small garden stood broken and rusted, its blades hanging at odd angles. She was surprised to find Elias there, sitting on a fallen log near what had once been her front porch. He looked up as she approached, and she could see that he'd been drinking. Not enough to be drunk, but enough to soften the hard edges of his control. I hope you don't mind, he said. I was doing my survey work and found myself here. Thought I'd sit for a while. It's not my land anymore. Clara settled beside him on the log, careful to keep some distance between them. What are you really doing here, Mr. Rowe? Elias was quiet for a moment, staring out at the ruins. I keep thinking about what you said, about the fire being murder. And I think you might be right. He pulled a silver flask from his pocket and offered it to her. Clara shook her head, so he took a sip and continued. I've been studying the maps, the records, the reports from the local authorities. Your fire wasn't the only one, was it? There were 3 others that year. All on land the railroad wanted to purchase. And all ruled accidental. By a sheriff who was bought and paid for. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the desert air began to cool. But saying it and proving it are 2 different things. What if someone could prove it? Clara looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I mean, what if someone had access to railroad records, correspondence, maybe even testimony from the men who were there? Elias's voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear the tension underneath. What if someone was in a position to expose the truth? That someone wouldn't live very long, I imagine. Probably not. Elias took another sip from his flask. But maybe that wouldn't matter. Maybe the truth would be worth dying for. Clara studied his profile in the dying light. You're not just a surveyor, are you, Mr. Rowe? I was a sniper during the war, Confederate Army, 3rd Tennessee. His voice was flat, emotionless. I killed a lot of men, Miss Devane. More than I can count, more than I can remember. When the war ended, I drifted for a while, did odd jobs, tried to drink myself to death. The railroad found me in a Kansas saloon, half dead from whiskey and guilt. They offered me work, a chance to use my skills for something other than killing. What skills? I can read land like other men read books. I can track a man across stone, see patterns where others see chaos. I can put a bullet through a silver dollar at 500 yards. Elias's laugh was bitter. Turns out those skills are useful for more than just war. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. They didn't hire you to survey land? Oh, I do survey land. I'm very good at it. But I also do other things when the situation requires it. Elias looked at her then, and his eyes were full of a pain so deep it made her chest ache. Things I'm not proud of. Things that keep me awake at night. Like setting fires. Like making problems disappear. Elias capped his flask and put it away. I've never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, Miss Devane. I've never hurt anyone who wasn't trying to hurt someone else. But I've stood by and watched while other men did things that... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Clara was quiet for a long time, processing what he'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but cold. Did you stand by and watch while someone burned my house down, Mr. Rowe? Did you watch while my husband died screaming in the flames? No. Elias's voice was fierce. I swear to you, I wasn't involved in that. I didn't even know about it until I started researching this area. But what? But the man who trained me, who brought me into the railroad's employ, he was involved. Colonel Marcus Thorne. He's the one who orchestrated the fires, who gave the orders. Elias turned to face her fully. He's also the one who sent me here to secure this land. Clara felt the world tilt around her. He sent you here knowing you'd figure it out? I don't think he expected me to care. I think he expected me to do my job and report back, same as always. Elias's hands were clenched into fists. But I do care, Miss Devane. I care more than I should, more than is safe. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Because I've seen too much death. Because I'm tired of being the instrument of other people's greed. Because ... He stopped, looked away. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, and I don't know how to live with that. Clara felt her breath catch. You don't know me. I know you speak for the dead when no one else will. I know you carry their stories like sacred things. I know you've been hurt worse than anyone should have to bear, and you're still here, still fighting, still trying to protect what matters. Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. I know you make me want to be a better man than I am. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind through the broken windmill and the distant call of coyotes. Clara felt something breaking open inside her chest, something she'd kept locked away since the night her world burned down. "My husband's name was Samuel," she said finally. "He was a good man, gentle. He used to read to me in the evenings, poetry mostly. Whitman, Dickinson, sometimes Shakespeare. He had dreams of building something beautiful here, something that would last." She looked out at the ruins of their home. "He died trying to save our wedding photographs. I'm sorry. He would have liked you, I think. He always said that broken things could be mended, that nothing was beyond redemption if you were willing to do the work." Clara's voice was thick with tears she wouldn't let fall. "I stopped believing that after he died. I thought some things were too broken to fix. And now? Now I think maybe he was right. Maybe redemption is just another word for choosing to be better than you were." Clara stood up, brushing dust from her skirts. "I should go. Mr. Whitmore will be wondering where I am. Miss Devane." Elias stood as well, reaching out as if to touch her arm, then letting his hand fall. "What I told you tonight will remain between us." Clara met his eyes. "But if you're planning to do something about Colonel Thorne, about what happened here, you should know that you won't be doing it alone. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes blazed with a fury that had been building for 3 years. "This is my fight, Mr. Rowe. It has been since the night I watched my life burn to ash." Elias nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to be careful. Thorne isn't just dangerous. He's smart. If he suspects I'm working against him, then we'll have to make sure he doesn't suspect until it's too late." Clara began walking back toward town, then paused. "Mr. Rowe, that windmill there, Samuel built it with his own hands. It's broken now, but the bones of it are still good. If someone were to fix it, to make it work again, it might be a sign that some things can be redeemed after all." She left him standing there in the growing darkness, and this time when she walked away, she could feel something other than despair settling in her chest. It felt dangerous and fragile and powerful all at once, like a flame that had been carefully banked but never quite extinguished. The next morning, Clara found Elias at the windmill, his sleeves rolled up and his hands black with grease and rust. He'd somehow managed to procure new parts for the mechanism, and the broken blades had been repaired with careful precision. As she watched, he fitted the last piece into place and stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. "Does it work?" she asked. "Let's find out." Elias released the brake, and slowly, creakily, the blades began to turn. The sound of moving water echoed from deep within the earth, and after a moment, clear liquid began to flow from the spout into the stone basin below. Clara knelt beside the basin, cupping the water in her hands. It was cold and clean, with a faint taste of minerals that she remembered from her childhood. "How did you know how to fix it?" "My father was a millwright before the war. He taught me to read the language of gears and springs." Elias settled beside her, his injured leg stretched out awkwardly. "I thought you might like to have it working again." "Thank you." Clara's voice was soft, but there was a weight to it that made Elias look at her sharply. "I have something to show you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and smoke damage. "I found this in the ruins after the fire. It was Samuel's. He used to write down everything, conversations, observations, things he'd heard in town. I thought it was just a habit. But now—" Elias took the journal, handling it carefully. As he read, his expression grew darker. He was tracking railroad activity, meeting dates, names, survey routes that didn't match the official records. He knew something was wrong. He was trying to gather evidence. Clara's voice was tight with old pain. The fire happened 3 days after he wrote the last entry. What did he write? That he'd found proof of the railroad's involvement in the other fires, that he was planning to take it to the territorial authorities. Clara's hands were shaking. He was going to get justice for those families, Mr. Rowe. He was going to make them pay. Elias closed the journal and handed it back to her. "They killed him for it." "Yes." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. And now they're back to finish what they started. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rhythmic creaking of the windmill and the sound of water flowing into the basin. The sun was climbing higher, and the desert air was beginning to shimmer with heat. "I've been thinking about what you said," Elias said finally. "About some things being worth dying for. And I think you're right. But I also think some things are worth living for." He looked at her then, and Clara could see the decision he'd made written in the lines of his face. "I'm going to wire my resignation to the railroad today. Tell them I'm staying in Ash Bluff to recover from an injury, that I'll need to delay my report. That will buy us time, but not much. Enough to gather the evidence we need. Your husband's journal is a start, but we'll need more. Documentation, witnesses, maybe even a confession if we're lucky." Elias's smile was grim. "I know how these men think, Miss Devane, how they operate. That gives us an advantage. What about Colonel Thorne? He'll come eventually, when I don't report back. When he realizes I'm not following orders, he'll come to finish the job himself." Elias's voice was matter of fact, but Clara could see the fear in his eyes. "When that happens, we'll be ready for him." "Will we?" Clara stood up, brushing dust from her skirts. "Mr. Rowe, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course." "If it comes down to a choice between your life and his, which would you choose?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. 3 months ago, I would have said his without hesitation. I've been dying slowly for years, Miss Devane, drowning in guilt and whiskey and the memory of all the things I've done wrong. Death would have been a mercy. And now I think I might have something to live for." He stood as well, favoring his injured leg. "But if it comes down to a choice between my life and yours, I know which one I'd choose. I know which one matters more." Clara felt her heart stop. "Mr. Rowe, Elias, please, if we're going to fight this battle together, you should at least call me by my name. Elias." The name felt strange on her tongue, but not unpleasant. "I don't need you to save me. I've been taking care of myself for 3 years. I know, but maybe we could take care of each other." His smile was crooked and uncertain. "I'm not asking for promises, Clara. I'm not asking for love or forever, or anything you're not ready to give. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that some broken things can be fixed, that some sins can be forgiven." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This man who had walked into her life, carrying secrets and sorrow, and a hope so fragile it was almost transparent. Then she reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Samuel used to say that love was the only thing that could make sense of all the senseless pain in the world," she said quietly. "I stopped believing that when he died, but maybe I'm ready to believe it again." Clara's smile was small but real. "Just don't make me regret it, Elias Rowe." "I'll do my best." That evening they sat together on the porch of the funeral parlor, watching the sun set over the desert. Clara had made coffee, and Elias had contributed a bottle of whiskey that he'd been saving for a special occasion. Neither of them had spoken much, but the silence was comfortable, weighted with possibility rather than grief. "Tell me about the war," Clara said suddenly. Elias's hand tightened around his cup. "What do you want to know?" "What it was like. What it did to you. Why you can't seem to forgive yourself for surviving it." Elias was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he was speaking of someone else's life. "I was good at it. That's the thing that haunts me most. I was very, very good at killing people from a distance. Good enough that they gave me special assignments, missions that required precision." He took a sip of whiskey. "There was a battle in Tennessee, 1863. Union forces had taken a position on a hill overlooking our supply lines. I was ordered to eliminate their officers, break their command structure." "And you did?" "I did. 5 men in as many minutes. Clean shots, all of them. professional. Elias's laugh was bitter. The Union line broke and we retook the position. Saved a lot of Confederate lives that day. I was commended for my service. But one of the men I killed was a chaplain. A man of God who was tending to the wounded, not fighting. I saw him in my scope, saw the cross on his uniform, and I killed him anyway because those were my orders. Elias's voice cracked. He was maybe 25 years old, with a face like a choir boy, and a letter from his wife in his pocket. I found the letter afterward when we swept the field. She was pregnant with their first child. Clara felt her heart break for him. Elias. I kept the letter. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would help me remember why I needed to be better, why I needed to atone. But all it did was remind me that I was a killer, that I'd taken a good man away from his family for the sake of military strategy. Elias finished his whiskey in one gulp. After the war, I tried to find his widow, to give her the letter, to tell her how sorry I was. But she died in childbirth, and the baby with her. Another casualty of my war. Clara reached over and took his hand. That's not your fault. Isn't it? If I'd refused the order, if I'd aimed just a little to the left, maybe you would have been court-martialed and shot for insubordination. Maybe your replacement would have been less skilled and killed a dozen men instead of 5. Maybe the battle would have been lost, and hundreds more would have died. Clara's voice was firm. You can't carry the weight of every consequence, Elias. You can't take responsibility for every tragedy that followed from your choices. Then how do I live with what I've done? The same way I live with the fact that I couldn't save Samuel from the fire. The same way anyone lives with impossible pain. Clara's voice was soft but steady. You carry it, and you let it change you, and you try to be better than you were. You find ways to honor the dead by how you choose to live. Elias looked at her, and Clara could see tears in his eyes. How do you do it? How do you stay so strong? I'm not strong. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference. Clara's smile was sad but genuine. And I have something to fight for now. Something to protect. The land, the truth, justice for Samuel and the others. And... She paused, then took a breath. And you. I have you to fight for now, Elias Rowe. God help us both. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A rider came into town just after dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, and his face grim with urgency. He went straight to the telegraph office, and within an hour the news was spreading through Ash Bluff like wildfire. Colonel Marcus Thorne was coming to town. He'd be arriving on the afternoon train with a small contingent of men, officially to assess the progress of the land acquisition negotiations. Unofficially, everyone knew what it meant. Thorne was coming to deal with the Elias Rowe problem personally. Clara found Elias at the windmill, where he'd been working since before sunrise. His face was set in hard lines, and his hands were steady as he cleaned and oiled the rifle he'd retrieved from his saddlebags. You heard? She asked. I heard. Elias's voice was calm, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. He's bringing 5 men with him. Professional guns, not railroad lackeys. This won't be a negotiation. Then we'll have to be ready for a fight. Elias looked up at her sharply. Clara, you can't be involved in this. If something happens to you, I'll be next on his list anyway. You know that. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact. Besides, this is my fight as much as yours. More, maybe. Elias was quiet for a moment, then nodded. What do you have in mind? I've been thinking about what you said. About knowing how these men operate. Clara settled beside him, her hands calm despite the fear she felt. They'll expect you to run, or to meet them head-on. They won't expect you to bring the fight to them. You're suggesting an ambush? I'm suggesting we choose our battleground instead of letting them choose theirs. Clara's eyes were hard. There's a place about 3 miles east of here, where the old mining road cuts through a canyon. It's the only practical route from the train station to the homestead. If we were to position ourselves there, We'd have the high ground and clear fields of fire. Elias's smile was grim. It's a good plan, but you're not going to be there, Clara. I won't let you. You won't let me? Clara's voice was dangerously quiet. Elias, I've been preparing for this fight for 3 years. I know every inch of this valley, every rock, every hiding place. You need me. I need you alive. And I need you to understand that I'm not some helpless woman who needs protection. I'm a woman who's been carrying a rifle since I was 12 years old, who spent the last 3 years learning to shoot and track and survive. I'm a woman who's had nothing to lose until now. Clara's voice softened. And now I have everything to lose, which makes me more dangerous than you can imagine. Elias stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this my way. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. If things go bad, you get out. Promise me that. I promise to do what needs to be done. Clara's smile was small but fierce, just like you. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Elias cleaned and checked their weapons while Clara gathered supplies, water, ammunition, field dressings in case someone got hurt. She also prepared something else, something that made Elias uneasy when he saw her mixing herbs and salt in a small leather pouch. What's that for? He asked. Protection, or justice, depending on how you look at it. Clara's voice was matter of fact. The Lakota elder I mentioned, Joseph Crow Feather. He taught me some things after Samuel died. Ways to honor the dead, ways to call on their strength when the living need help. Clara, I don't think you don't have to believe in it, Elias. But I do. And right now, I need to believe that Samuel and all the others who died are with us. Clara tied the pouch to her belt. I need to believe that we're not fighting this alone. The afternoon train arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, black smoke billowing against the blue desert sky. Clara and Elias were already in position in the canyon, hidden among the rocks with clear sight lines down the mining road. They'd chosen their spot carefully, high enough to see anyone approaching, with multiple escape routes if things went wrong. Elias lay prone behind a natural stone barricade, his rifle trained on the road below. Clara was positioned about 50 yards to his left, with both a rifle and Samuel's old shotgun within easy reach. Between them, they had enough ammunition for a prolonged fight, and enough cover to make themselves difficult targets. They didn't have to wait long. Just after 3 o'clock, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Colonel Marcus Thorne rode at the head of the group, a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes. He wore a dark suit that managed to look crisp despite the desert heat, and he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never doubted his own authority. The men with him were exactly what Elias had expected. Professional killers dressed like gentlemen, armed with the latest rifles and revolvers. They rode in a loose formation that spoke of military training and long experience with violence. "Elias Rowe," Thorne called out when they were still 100 yards away. His voice carried easily in the thin air. "I know you're up there somewhere. Why don't you come down, and we can discuss this like civilized men?" Elias didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that words were just another weapon in a man like Thorne's arsenal, and he had no intention of giving the colonel any advantage. "Come now, Elias. There's no need for dramatics. You've simply been in the field too long, that's all. Gotten too close to the situation." Thorne's tone was reasonable, almost paternal. "Return to your duties, file your report, and we can forget this unfortunate lapse in judgment." Still silence from the rocks above. Thorne's expression hardened. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. I trained you better than this. You know how this ends." "Yes," Elias called back, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I do." The first shot came from one of Thorne's men, a hasty thing that chipped rock near Clara's position. It was the signal everyone had been waiting for, and suddenly, the canyon erupted in gunfire. Elias's first shot took down the man who'd fired at Clara, a clean kill that dropped him from his horse before he could get off a second round. Clara's shotgun boomed a moment later, catching another of Thorne's men in the chest as he tried to find cover behind a boulder. The remaining 3 men scattered, using their horses and the natural cover of the canyon to return fire. But Elias had chosen their position well. The high ground gave them clear sight lines, and the narrow confines of the canyon made it difficult for Thorne's men to maneuver. "You can't win this, Elias!" Thorne shouted over the gunfire. "There are more men coming. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick." Elias's answer was another rifle shot that put a hole through Thorne's hat. The colonel dove for cover, his calm demeanor finally cracking. The battle raged for nearly an hour, bullets ricocheting off stone and the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Clara proved to be as good a shot as she'd claimed, her rifle barking regularly as she kept Thorne's men pinned down. But they were professionals, and slowly they began to work their way up the canyon walls, using whatever cover they could find. It was during a lull in the fighting that Clara noticed the smoke. "Elias," she called out, her voice tight with alarm. "Look toward town." Elias risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his blood run cold. A thick column of black smoke was rising from the direction of Ash Bluff, and even at this distance they could see the orange glow of flames. "The funeral parlor," Clara whispered. "Mr. Whitmore." "It's a diversion," Elias said grimly. "Thorne's trying to draw you out, get you to abandon your position. Then it's working." Clara was already gathering her weapons. "I have to go back. Clara, wait." But she was already moving, using the rocks for cover as she worked her way down the canyon wall. Elias cursed and sent another shot toward Thorne's position, trying to keep them suppressed, while Clara made her escape. He was so focused on covering her retreat that he didn't see the man who'd worked his way around to his flank until it was too late. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocks. "Got him!" the shooter called out, and suddenly the canyon was alive with moving figures as Thorne's remaining men closed in. Elias drew his sidearm with his good hand, managing to wound one of the advancing men before a rifle butt to the head sent him sprawling. When the stars cleared from his vision, he found himself looking up at Colonel Marcus Thorne. "Hello, Elias," Thorne said pleasantly. "I do hope you're prepared to be reasonable now." The fire had been carefully planned, Elias realized as Thorne's men dragged him back toward town. It was contained enough to serve as a distraction without destroying the entire settlement. Just the funeral parlor and the small house where Clara lived. A message and a trap, all in one. They found Clara kneeling in the ashes, her face streaked with tears and soot. Mr. Whitmore lay beside her, a bullet hole in his chest and his kind eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. He'd been shot trying to save his business, his life's work, from the flames. "Ah, Miss Devane," Thorne said as his men forced Elias to his knees beside her. "I was hoping you'd join us. It seems your friend here has been filling your head with unfortunate ideas about justice and redemption." Clara looked up at him, and Elias was surprised to see not fear in her eyes, but rage. Pure, clean rage that burned hotter than the flames that had taken everything she cared about. "You killed him," she said quietly. "You killed a good man who never hurt anyone in his life." "I did what was necessary to secure valuable land for the railroad. Sometimes that requires unpleasant choices." Thorne's voice was matter of fact. "Just as I'm about to make an unpleasant choice about you and Mr. Rowe." "You won't get away with this," Elias said through gritted teeth. "People will ask questions." "What people?" "The sheriff is in my employ, and most of the townspeople are too frightened or too poor to cause trouble." Thorne smiled coldly. "Besides, who's going to believe that the railroad would go to such lengths over a few acres of worthless desert?" "No, I think the official story will be much simpler. A tragic accident during a land dispute. Perhaps Miss Devane's grief over her employer's death drove her to violence. Perhaps she and her lover killed each other in a fit of passion." "That's your plan?" Clara's voice was steady, but Elias could see her hand moving slowly toward the small pouch at her belt. "Make it look like we killed each other? Poetry in motion, don't you think? The grieving widow and the guilt-ridden veteran, finding solace in each other's arms before the weight of their sins became too much to bear. Thorn gestured to his men. "Take them to the old homestead. Make it look convincing." As Thorn's men hauled them to their feet, Clara's fingers found the pouch. She tore it open, scattering herbs and salt into the wind, while speaking words in a language Elias didn't recognize. It might have been Lakota, or something older, something that predated the arrival of white men in this desert. Thorn laughed. "Really, Miss Devane? Witchcraft? I expected better from an educated woman." "Not witchcraft," Clara said quietly. "Justice. And you're about to discover the difference." The wind picked up suddenly, swirling dust and debris around the group. In the distance, thunder rumbled across a cloudless sky, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an electric tension that made the horses nervous. "Superstitious nonsense," Thorn muttered, but Elias noticed that his voice lacked its earlier confidence. They were halfway to the old homestead when the first of Thorn's men fell. He simply toppled from his saddle without a sound, and when they checked his body, they found no wound, no explanation for his sudden death. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. "What the hell?" one of the remaining men started to say, then gasped and clutched at his throat. He fell a moment later, choking on air that had suddenly become too thick to breathe. Thorn wheeled his horse around, looking for threats that weren't there. "What's happening?" "What did you do?" Clara's smile was terrible to behold. "I called on the dead, Colonel. I asked them to come collect what's owed." The last of Thorn's men broke and ran, spurring his horse toward the desert. He made it maybe 50 yards before something invisible pulled him from his saddle. His screams echoed across the valley until they cut off with chilling abruptness. Now it was just the four of them, Thorn, Clara, Elias, and the gathering storm that had risen from nowhere. The air crackled with energy, and in the swirling dust, Elias could swear he saw shapes moving. Human figures, or the shadows of human figures, walking with purpose toward their little group. "This is impossible," Thorn said, but his voice shook. "This is just coincidence, just justice," Clara said firmly. "Samuel Devane sends his regards, Colonel. So do the Fairweathers, and the Hendersons, and all the others you murdered for their land." Thorn raised his gun, pointing it at Clara's head. "Enough! I don't know how you're doing this, but it ends now." The shot that rang out came not from Thorn's weapon, but from behind them. The colonel staggered, a red stain spreading across his chest, and turned to see Elias holding a smoking derringer, a backup weapon he'd managed to palm during the confusion. "That's for Samuel Devane," Elias said quietly, "and for all the others." Thorn fell to his knees, then onto his face in the dirt. The wind died suddenly, and the strange electrical tension faded from the air. In the silence that followed, Clara and Elias could hear nothing but their own ragged breathing and the distant sound of water flowing from the repaired windmill. "Is it over?" Clara asked. "It's over," Elias confirmed, though he was looking at his chest where a spreading stain of blood marked where Thorn's final shot had found its mark. Clara saw the blood at the same moment and rushed to his side. "Elias, no!" "It's all right," he said, sinking to the ground beside Thorn's body. "It's all right, Clara. We did it. We got justice for Samuel, for all of them." "Don't you dare!" Clara said fiercely, pressing her hands to the wound in his chest. "Don't you dare leave me now, Elias Rowe." "Not when we've just found each other." "I'm sorry," Elias whispered, his voice growing weaker. "I'm sorry I couldn't give you more time. I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you deserved." "You are the man I needed," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "You're the man who helped me remember that love is possible after loss, that redemption is real. You're the man who fixed my windmill and gave me back my faith in justice." Elias smiled, a peaceful expression settling over his features. "Some love burns everything down," he said, repeating her words from what seemed like a lifetime ago. "Some love stays and watches it grow back." "Yes," Clara whispered, leaning down to kiss him for the first and last time. "Yes, it does." He died in her arms as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. Clara held him until the stars came out, whispering words of love and forgiveness, and promises to remember him always. The years that followed were kinder to Clara than the ones that had come before. The railroad, faced with the mysterious disappearance of Colonel Thorne and his men, quietly abandoned their plans for expansion through the valley. The territorial authorities, presented with Samuel's journal and other evidence that Clara had carefully preserved, launched an investigation that eventually led to justice for many of the railroad's victims. Clara used the settlement money to purchase the old Devane homestead and the surrounding land. She rebuilt the house, not as it had been, but as something new, a place of healing and hope rather than just survival. The windmill Elias had repaired continued to pump clear water from deep wells, and Clara used it to create gardens where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the desert's harshness. She became in time exactly what the townspeople had always said she was, a woman who spoke for the dead, who helped them find peace. But she also became something more, a woman who helped the living find their way back to hope. Travelers came to her door seeking shelter, healing, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving great loss and choosing to love again despite it. The cemetery grew as well, carefully tended and filled with flowers that Clara planted in memory of those who had no one else to remember them. She buried Elias there, beneath a simple stone that read, "He chose love over duty, justice over safety, and redemption over revenge." Beside his grave, she planted a young oak tree that grew strong and straight, its roots reaching deep into the soil that had been watered with so much blood and tears. On quiet evenings, when the wind was just right, the people of Ash Bluff swore they could see two figures walking together among the graves, a woman in black and a man with a slight limp, tending to the flowers and speaking words of comfort to the dead. Some said it was just Clara and the child she'd adopted, a Lakota boy whose grandmother had passed away the winter after the shooting. Others claimed it was something more, evidence that love could transcend even death itself. Clara never confirmed or denied the stories. She simply went about her work, caring for the living and the dead with equal devotion, carrying in her heart the memory of a man who had taught her that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to seek it. And in the evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the valley, she would sit beside the windmill and listen to the sound of water flowing, knowing that some things, love, hope, the promise of renewal, could never be destroyed, no matter how much flame and fury the world might bring. The story of Clara Devane and Elias Rowe became legend in the years that followed, told and retold around campfires and in saloons, growing larger with each telling. Some versions painted them as tragic lovers, destroyed by forces beyond their control. Others cast them as avenging angels, bringing justice to a lawless land. But those who knew Clara in her later years understood that the truth was both simpler and more profound than any legend. They had been two broken people who found each other in a broken place, and together they had chosen to create something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. They had proven that love, real love, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything, could indeed make sense of senseless suffering, could transform the most barren ground into something that bloomed with life and hope and the promise of tomorrow. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. That was the only story worth telling, the only legacy worth leaving behind. In a world that often seemed determined to destroy anything good or beautiful or true, they had chosen to build instead of burn, to heal instead of harm, to love instead of hate. And their love, like the wildflowers that bloomed each spring in the cemetery they had created together, continued to grow long after they were gone, taking root in the hearts of everyone who heard their story and dared to believe that redemption was possible, that broken things could be mended, and that sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, love really could conquer death itself.